Now coming up, we have people from Australia INGOs to come and give us a speech. The first representative, she's the Executive Officer of Union Aid Abroad, APHEDA, the Global Justice Organization of the Australian Union Movement. So APHEDA has been supporting the pro-democracy struggle in Myanmar since the mid-1990s. It supports civil society organizations and unions around the world, and proudly stands with those in Thai-Myanmar border and inside Myanmar struggling for liberation against military tyranny. May I invite Kate Lee to come in here and give us a speech.
Okay, Mazaga Bejabi Tabare, Kian, Diana Gosle, Usolongo, to Jesus Shibashin. She Maza Bejabi Tabare, Diana Goslemia Alongole, Kanasis and Dumiane, Jishuni Jadumia Gosa, Jesu Tutinshija, Bejaluarishin. A good notasi Singaro, Australia got INGO rega Mazaga Bejabi Tamabipare, Betama Gosolearo, Australia Bidam Zulu Shamuye, Kabalon Saya, Diamia Damu Puesi, Union Aid Abroad, APHEDA yet Musan Yashi Pipare, APHEDA. ဆိုရင်1990ပြည့်လွန်နှစ်များကလေးကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာဒီမိုကရေစီရေးကြိုးပမ်းမှုတွေကိုပံ့ပိုးပေးခဲ့ပါတယ်။သူတို့ကကမ္ဘာတဝန်းမှာရှိတဲ့အရက်ဖက်အဖွဲ့အစည်းတွေနဲ့သမဂ္ဂတွေကိုလည်းပံ့ပိုးကူညီမှုတွေထိုင်းမြန်မာနယ်စပ်နဲ့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံအတွင်းကစစ်အာဏာရှင်တွေရဲ့လွတ်မြောက်ရေးအတွက်ရုန်းကန်လှုပ်ရှားနေသူတွေကိုလည်းဂုဏ်ယူစွာပံ့ပိုးပေးလျက်ရှိပါတယ်ရှင်။အမှာစကားပြောကြားပေးဖို့အတွက် Kaylee ကိုဖိတ်ခေါ်လိုပါတယ်။
Mingalaba. Good afternoon, dear friends. I'll start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge the Indigenous people's sovereignty over this land, and that has never been ceded by Aboriginal people. This will always be Aboriginal land. Thank you to CRPH and NUG Australia for organising this important event and for inviting me and APHEDA here today to be part of it. We are horrified by the escalation of repression in Myanmar, and we continue to call on the Australian community and the international community and the Australian government to escalate its interventions. And we support you all in the continued campaigning that you continue to do in support of human rights for your country women and country men inside Myanmar. So today we stand here in solidarity with you and all peoples of Myanmar. We especially acknowledge today the recent attacks on the Chin peoples, and as your Minister for Human Rights just noted earlier, this shows the hallmarks of yet another genocide. And as Saw Lewin Oo just noted, only a fraction of the atrocities inflicted on ethnic peoples are actually reported in the media. So this is really horrifying. And it also confirms the importance of today's event to emphasise the role that the international community has in taking action, criminal action against the junta. I also bring greetings and the strongest solidarity from trade unions across the Asia-Pacific region who stand with Myanmar. And that includes the Australian Council of Trade Unions, which has been active in working with and supporting diaspora movements in Australia and very much supports the NUG and its representative here. And I, as a representative of APHEDA, I'm also working with unions across our region to support the demands of the CDM and support the demands of the Myanmar union movement for a return to democratic rule of the country. As of yesterday, as you all know, the death toll has reached 1,258 people. That's 1,258 people who have died needlessly, but for their strong determination for democracy in Myanmar. They won't be forgotten. They will be remembered by us all. And there are still many still detained, and we will continue to fight for the release of these people. And we know that 1,954 people are still on the run, and we support calls for them to be released from that burden. where they fear that they will be arrested or killed at any moment. And since the start of the coup, as you all know, many workers have been at the forefront of the civil disobedience movement, whether they're doctors and nurses or engineers, teachers, bank workers, railway workers, oil and gas workers. And entire areas of the civil service have been shut down by workers walking out to join the CDM. And these workers continue to be targeted for arrest. I will post in the live stream later on our recent documentation that we've helped gather to provide to the International Labour Organization for the documentation of labour rights violations against workers and trade unionists. Because we know that the military junta has named 16 labour rights organisations as being illegal, and individuals involved in those organisations have been effectively in hiding or underground since they were named illegal back in February. And as I mentioned earlier, workers and union leaders remain detained and continue to be arrested. And the international trade union movement has demanded and continues to demand for their release. Specifically, we call for the release today, and we continue to call for the release of Thet Ninh Ong, the General Secretary of the Myanmar Industry, Crafts and Services Trade Union Federation. He's been detained since June, and now he's facing a military court later this month. So today we continue our calls on the Australian government, and we certainly agree with the parliamentarians earlier who remain disappointed that our government has not responded formally to the parliamentary inquiry and its report from earlier this year in April. And we expect our government, before the year is out, to respond formally to that report, because that report demonstrates the concerns of all of you as the Australian Myanmar diaspora, and many other human rights aid organisations, as well as the Australian Council of Trade Unions, who also had input into that recommendations of that inquiry. So today we support the calls for investigation by the Australian government into the crimes against humanity by the junta. We call on the Australian government to apply comprehensive targeted sanctions against the military, its leaders and its business interests and business partners. This should include family members of senior military leaders who are residing here in Australia. It should include the military corporations, the MEC and the MEHL. We also call on all Australian businesses operating in Myanmar to suspend operations and divest from any relationships with military-owned, controlled, or linked businesses and organisations. We call on the Australian government to take urgent steps to block the global arms trade to Myanmar. And we also call on our government to provide urgent assistance to the national civil disobedience movement, and to provide all forms of practical and diplomatic assistance to the movement via the Australian Embassy in Yangon. And of course, like many around the world, we want the Australian government to formally recognise the NUG and to deliver urgent humanitarian assistance in consultation with the NUG. Today, I also heard the calls that were made by your Minister for Human Rights, where he called on the Australian government around a range of demands that it could take on this day today and at this event, and we'll be following up to write to our government and to seek meetings with it to follow through on those recommendations made by your Minister for Human Rights today. So in closing, I'd just like to express full solidarity to you all from Union Aid Abroad APHEDA, from the Australian Union Movement, and from unions all around the world who are totally united as you continue and have to continue to struggle for democracy in your country. And we'll continue to stand with you until you've won your full human rights. Solidarity.
Thank you, Kate, for coming here today and giving us very encouraging words to all our viewers and to all Burmese people who's viewing us today.